Hey, everybody. Welcome to the 11th episode of the Edgar Church's Basement podcast with your host, me, Rob Larson. I run a YouTube channel at It's All Just Comics and a blog, itsalljustcomics.com, where I talk about comics, collectible comics, original art, high-end collectible comics, pedigree comics, old collections, old catalogs, new auction catalogs. If it's collectible and it's especially expensive, I'm probably talking about it. This podcast is an adjunct to that, where I can kind of talk about things in a free-form manner. This episode was inspired earlier today. So I had episode 11. I've been kind of working on it, and I don't script these, so I kind of just sit there and talk. And I had kind of half an audio file, and I just couldn't figure out how to finish it. And so I was like, this is driving me crazy, and this podcast is supposed to be fun. And then somebody commented about how Restored comics from CGC absolutely destroyed the market for restored comics. It was on a video talking about a potential $1 million restored Action Comics #1. There's one listed on Metropolis right now for $1 million. It won't sell for that, but it was listed at that, and I've been speculating that that's going to happen at some point soon. So I was like, and I just had commented. I was like, that's really great. I've been talking about it for a long time. And then I commented, earlier today, like I said, I'm going to do a podcast episode about that. And so here we are talking about restored comic books. And it's funny that I haven't covered this before because I've been talking about it for 25 years. Basically, as soon as I got in the CGC forum and we started to discuss comics, and we started to wrap our heads around CGC, and just remember, 25 years ago, this was all very strange. We had coin collectors who could kind of give us some sense of what was going on, and we were talking to people that were very knowledgeable about, what CGC was trying to do, including Steve Borok and Paul Litch and, Mark and all of these people around at that point. And so we had a lot of understanding of what was going on, but it was still new, and we weren't quite sure what, things meant, right? And there's certain things that are very obvious about that. Like the early census was horrible. It was useful. It was great. It was great that we had it, but it skewed things in ways that made some early results kind of crazy. The first X in 9.8, some Bronze Age book would sell for a ridiculous amount of money, and then, 5 years later, there'd be 40 of them, right? Things like that. But it made a lot of money for early adopters, so there is that. I sold some stuff back then that the one I always talk about is a Daredevil 131 at CGC 9.2, right before that movie came out, that terrible Ben Affleck movie. And it was the first one that had come up for sale in a while, and it was just a 9.2, but I sold it for $400. I don't think that record was broken. This was 2003, I think. I don't think that record was broken until 2018 or something like that. It took a long time for somebody to get that book. Sell that book for more than $400. Anyway, but one of the things that was readily apparent early, and we had an acronym for it, so it was Purple Label of Death or Purple Label of Doom. I like of Doom better, but that's just me. PLOD. Values for restored books were killed so much, absolutely destroyed by CGC. It's partially just it was a different color label. It was partially, it did bring in some other people new to the hobby that kind of didn't understand that we had, in fact, kind of liked restoration before that. One other thing I should mention, actually, is one of the reasons that there was such a backlash against purple labels and against restoration is because it uncovered a lot of hidden restoration that had been going on, right? It's one thing if you have a book, it's been worked on by somebody like Susan Ciccone, you get the restoration report, they say what they did, it's sold that way. That's one thing. But what happens, and what had happened, it still happens, unfortunately, but it's caught more often. But what happened back in the day is people would do restoration to books. And because not everyone knows how to spot restoration, and even, I know how to do some of it, but I'm not going to catch everything. There's no way. I'm not that good. I know the basics. I have basic tools, but I don't have, the same skills that somebody like, Matt Nelson or whatever has. So, So that's one of the big things that happened is there was this backlash because people realized they had been ripped off. They had been sold books that were supposed to be unrestored and they had been worked on. There was a bunch of unknown, color touch and of course, trimming and all of those sort of things. So yeah, that's just another aspect I feel like I should touch on. They kind of fed in very early on in the incredible backlash against restoration in comic books at the dawn of the CGC era. I'm of two opinions on it. So let's start there. One is I feel like it went too far. And so, one of the examples that I've been talking about for literally 24 years, 23 years, whenever I started on the CGC forum, is the Action Comics #1, CGC 8.5, the Rusty Staple book, right? So that book has rusty staples. There's no world in which you should have $1 million+ collectible. Even at the time it was graded, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was the most valuable CGC graded book. And it had rusty staples, which is not good. Like, it's not good for paper to sit next to rust, and the staples will eventually just crumble, right? They're structural elements that keep the book together. And there is actually rust migration from the staples onto the paper. So you don't want that, right? You just don't. That's not good for an already 80-year-old, well, at the time, not 80 years, but 60-year-old at the time, a 60-plus-year-old artifact, a paper artifact made with cheap paper, terrible materials, etc. You don't want rust there. But you couldn't touch it. You can't do anything with it because you would destroy the value of that book. And that's wrong. Like, that's wrong. It's wrong. And you have things like, I mean, I understand it. I get it. But it's like you have things like the Superman #1, Mile High Edgar Church copy, which has pieces missing on the interior. It doesn't affect the story, but there's like, pieces out of the interior. And it's a gorgeous book externally, right? CGC 8.5. Record holder for a little while is the most valuable comic book of all time. But that was restored. So when Bashara bought it, it had restoration. So the pages were complete. You could flip through it and you wouldn't see that there was pieces missing. When it went into a CGC holder, that restoration was removed. And so I got a blue label, which is kind of crazy. And then you have books that clearly should be restored. So you have, tan or brittle pages. You can treat the paper to stop it from decaying, right? You can do that. It's pretty well known, and it happens outside of comics all the time to paper collectibles. But you can't do that, right? Like, you couldn't at all for a long time. Now we have the Conserved label, but for a long time, like, all of this work, whether it was aesthetic or to stabilize the book, was lumped under, the PLOD, the dreaded purple label of death, right? And so you couldn't do anything to these books. So it's put us into a position where we do kind of things that are not good for these collectibles that we love so much, right? We're letting them degrade. We're letting them be destroyed from the inside out because we can't treat them in ways that you do treat other paper collectibles, right? Like, I collect, I collect a lot of modern prints and original art, street art kind of stuff. But I also, as a sideline, I collect etchings from the 1900s, right? And late 1800s. People like, Manet or Whistler. And I have a beautiful Whistler etching that I had, $500 worth of restoration done. I got it pretty cheap. I had $500 worth of restoration done on it, and it's absolutely beautiful. It was pressed and cleaned. It was cleaned and pressed, and it was they whitened the paper, and it was just beautiful work by a local restorer here in Boston. And that's common, and it added value to the piece. I mean, actually, that piece is worth less now because that market is kind of cratered, but it doesn't matter. It's on my wall. But that's totally, you just do that, right? You have a piece of paper like that's beautiful and, has some problems with it, a little bit of foxing or whatever, and you just get it taken care of. It's not that expensive. It's well known. And so, that's what you do with other things. With comics, you can't do it. Now, okay, so that's one part, right? Is that we're handcuffed and not able to perform work on these books that would actually be good for them. So that's a bad thing. And that's kind of been driven me crazy for a long time, with the most important example being one of the most valuable comic books in the world, the CGC 8.5 Action Comics #1. The flip side of that, and this I also agree with, so I have two kind of thoughts that are at war with each other in my head. The flip side of that, and this is coming from a person who spent a lot of time studying pedigree comic books, specifically White Mountain and Edgar Church. And there is no doubt in my mind that the value of an unrestored CGC 9.6 comic from the Golden Age should be a unicorn, right? It should not be. I mean, I'm not going to say, the last person in the world that's going to say that a restored, and in fact, it is a restored, the book I was talking about was a restored Action Comics #1, CGC 9.0 Moderate Restoration. I'm not going to say that that should be worth as much as either one of the 9.0s, or if there was a 9.4 in a CGC restored holder, I'm not going to say that that's worth as much as the Edgar Church Mile High copy, right? But the penalty that we put on restored books, was too far. That's the earlier part. But it is important. It is so important to highlight how remarkable it is to have these things in unrestored condition, right? And there should be a premium. There definitely should be, because when you look at the population, especially of Golden Age books, some of these books, I mean, I can tell you off the top of my head the entire population above 8.0 of maybe 25 Golden Age keys, right? Like off the top of my head, I can there's a Larson, and then there's a Mile High that Dave's got, and whatever, right? And yeah, and a lot of times, again, I know who has it, or whatever, right? Because some of these are well-known collections. And that's just crazy that those numbers are so small. That's just insane. And to get something like, it's a mythical book, the Action Comics #1 church copy, which is, 9.2 or 9.4 or whatever. And it's, one of a couple hundred maybe that exist at all. That's crazy. And that it's unrestored and just perfect is something that we do need to treasure. And it is remarkable, right? Like it's heightened. I mean, that's the good thing about this, is that it's heightened our understanding of how rare some of these things can be, how important condition is. And CGC has allowed us to really quantify condition in a way that we never had before. Obviously, we had the 100-point grading system with the Sotheby's auctions and the American Association of Comic Book Collectors grading committee and things like that. And then Fischler got it down to 10 because, of course, no one's that good that you can tell the difference between a 78 and a 79. And it mapped, it is important that it mapped directly to some of the grades that we had used, right? It was mapped to the letter grades that we had used. So it was very familiar. But it's also statistical, right? You can crunch numbers like I do on EdgarChurchData.com. You can see the average of all of the church books in CGC holders. I think it's just funny because we have these two thoughts and these two things that I think are true, right? Like one is that we went too far. We went way too far in terms of the value of restored books. I can't remember what it was, but I talked to Steve Borak about buying a restored book in the 90s for over $100,000. And a $100,000 restored book didn't happen until 2008. I think a Detective 27 sold for over $100,000. And I remember that because it was crazy at the time, right? It had taken a long time for us to bring enough value back to restored books to have a Detective 27 sell for over $100,000. And he had bought something. I don't remember what it was. And I'm not sure I could actually search for it because I would have had to write about it to remember. But yeah, I remember having that conversation in Chicago. It was just there was no way. This was 2004, maybe 2005. And at that point, there was no way a restored book was going to sell for over $100,000. So, we did go too far, but it is also true. It can also be true that the value we place on the highest graded unrestored books, the most perfect books in the hobby, which has been accentuated by CGC by a great degree, I think is valid. If you look at the best copies of the best books, they're truly magical, They're crazy. It's crazy that there's books from, assuming the Allentown is as I imagine, the Allentown Detective 27 is CGC 9.4, 9.6. That's crazy. That's crazy that book is that nice, right? Captain America Comics #1, Allentown is incredible, right? It's an incredible book. By all accounts, the Action Comics #1 church copy is incredible, right? And, we should embrace that. But that doesn't mean that we haven't beaten up restored books. And actually, one of the things that I haven't talked about in this that I need to kind of research, which will be difficult because I need to get the data, is to take a look at the relative value of conserved books, right? Because we now have this conserved label, which I applauded. It came, 20 years too late because restoration had already been destroyed in the comics hobby. But we have the conserved label, which is really what I was talking about. Like, I'm not going to argue for books that have had pieces added and color touch and have had aesthetic changes made to them. Although I've had books restored and love restored books. Let me tell you about my Superman 14 one time. The conservation, the ability to replace the staples on a book. Actually, I don't even know if that qualifies. It's pretty invasive. You have to take the book apart. But like that, CGC 8.5 Action Comics #1 should never have been allowed to sit around with those staples. It just shouldn't have been. But then again, if it takes 40% of the value, if it knocks it down by 60%, right, then you wouldn't do it. So I actually have to look and see what the conserved label does to the value of books. I know it's not 100%, right? It wouldn't be, but nor should it be. But is it 20%? Is it 50%? I don't know. We'll see. At the end of the day, it's 10% right now, right? We're talking about this Action Comics #1, CGC 9.0 moderate restoration that's listed for $1 million. If one of the 9.0s came back out, you'd have to assume it would sell for over $10 million. So we're still at 10% of the value, which is is interesting. It is a rising tide, right? Lifting all boats. So I don't know. That was pretty rambly, but it is something I've been thinking about for a long time, and it is, I think, an interesting topic of discussion. There's no, right or wrong in this stuff. Hobbies and collectible fields all figure out restoration in their own way. Obviously, the art world, it's fine, right? Like I said, I talked about earlier, I've had prints restored. You certainly can have a painting restored. Every major painting in every major institution that's older than maybe 200 years has been cleaned, for sure. But you also have to do, filling in paint and removing overpainting, and you have to work with these objects to keep them around. Classic cars, there's a wide gamut of what you're able to do with a classic car and still have it be considered a car that is from like 1950. Each hobby has its own thing. Cards are the same way as comics, right? You have something that's had work done to it, it gets destroyed. Cleaned coins are not great, but then you look at the example of, like I said, original paintings and prints, and it's an entirely different world. So I don't know. I think we've got it right in that, in the broad sense. I think we've got it right. I think we need to embrace the value of unrestored comics because they're remarkable. High grade unrestored comics are remarkable, but I think that we've been too harsh collectively in the CGC era, which is a long time. Let's be fair. It's almost half the hobby at this point. The organized hobby is. I've never mentioned this before, but I really, I'm a fan of Jerry Weiss. And the '60s were obviously a huge part of the hobby, but the way I look at it in terms of data and the kind of organized manner of the hobby, and this is why I hold Bob Overstreet in such high esteem, I kind of look at it from the Overstreet Price Guide #1, because it took it to the next level, and then CGC came and took us to the next level again. Which is not to diss anybody that was a pioneer before, because like I said, one of my heroes in this hobby is Jerry Weiss, who was clearly involved before Bob Overstreet put out his first price guide. So, But, it's 1970 to 2000, right? So we had 30 years. Now we've had 25 years of the CGC era. So anyway, we had 30 years where, restoration was actually encouraged. It was loved, improving the aesthetic and monetary value of comics with restoration was an important part of the hobby. And then the CGC era came, and restoration was the worst thing that you could possibly do. And I think that we went too far in both directions, right? There was too much work done on books that really didn't need the work done in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then we've pulled the rug out from underneath restoration now here in the 2000s and on. I mean, Susan Ciccone doesn't do restoration anymore. She just presses books. And probably I've never used her to press a book because it just feels ridiculous. I have used her for restoration, and she's amazing. And it just seemed like bringing in, a bazooka to a knife fight, having Susan Ciccone press one of my books. I mean, again, I'm not, I haven't recently pressed anything that was super valuable. But when I did do valuable stuff, I just sent it to Matt at CGC. I was like, well, let's just go straight to the horse's mouth. Anyway, full disclosure. Maybe by the time we get to 2030 and we've had 30 years of CGC and 30 years of not CGC, we'll get to a more balanced approach and appreciation of restored books because they're important. They're an important part of the hobby. A lot of really important books are restored. The best Adventure 40 is a restored book. The Edgar Church Mile High copy is restored, unfortunately. So that's it. I already was kind of doing an outro, and then I got distracted again because it's such a fascinating topic to me and touches on so many things that I'm interested in talking about. So yeah, thank you for checking this one out. If you're on YouTube, you will have seen some interesting scans. If you're listening to it somewhere else, go to YouTube and you can watch some interesting images of restored books. I'm not sure what the next one will be about, although this topic has kind of opened up some old thoughts that I've had, some things that I've talked about for many years that I haven't talked about either on the YouTube channel or here on the blog. So I might revisit some of those here, which would be fun because this one was fun. Otherwise, check out the YouTube channel, subscribe there, like some videos, leave a comment if you're watching this on YouTube about what you think about restored books. Do you think we went too far? Do you think we didn't go far enough? Should people who restore books be banished from the hobby? Just kidding. You would have to banish me, and come on, you can't do that. Anyway, I really appreciate you guys. Have a lot of fun doing this, and I will see you in the next one.